Do refugee camps have history? This was the fundamental question at the base of the nomination of the Hesha refugee camp as UNESCO World Heritage Site. Refugee camps are established with the intention of being demolished. They are not accepted to have a history or a future. They are meant to be forgotten. The history of refugee camps is constantly erased, dismissed by states, humanitarian organizations, international agencies, and even by refugee community themselves, in fear that any acknowledgement of the present undermines their right of return. The only history, in fact, that is recognized within refugee communities is one of violence, suffering, and humiliation. How then we understand the life and the culture that people built in camps, despite suffering and marginalization? The photo that you see here are part of the UNESCO dossier produced in over 2 years of discussions with refugee communities, local residents, heritage experts, and cultural producers. Members of the camp strongly expressed their fear that the nomination would change the status quo and threaten to undermine the legally recognized right of return. At the same time, many expressed their desire to see refugee history being acknowledged, an attempt to bring back the right of return at the center of the political discussion. We were interested here in documenting the life, the spaces, and the political structures that emerge in almost 7 decades of exile. Palestinian camps are not made anymore of tents. They are complex urban structure, and we don't have the right vocabulary to understand and describe this forced condition of permanent temporariness. In understanding today's refugee condition beyond the humanitarian crisis, refugee heritage traces, documents, reveals, and represent refugee history beyond the narrative of suffering and displacement. Palestine is a territory traversed by innumerable borderlines. These lines, made of few millimeters on maps, result in hundreds of meters in reality and have a dramatic impact on people's lives. This project starts with a question. With different state authorities claiming sovereignty on the 2 sides of the line, we asked ourselves, who owns the thickness of the line? Paradoxically, we believe it is in these very lines that the ungrounded power of sovereign states could be revealed. And maybe in these territorial cracks, we can start to see a common community beyond the nation state.
At a certain point, we met Khalil Tafakji, and he's a Palestinian geographer, and he was explaining to us there was this very strange political fight between Israel and Palestine, where Arafat at that time was trying to push as much possible the parliament inside Jerusalem. So for him to claim that Jerusalem is a Palestinian capital, while the Israelis were trying to push as much as they can the parliament outside of the borders of Jerusalem. And by this, what happened really is that at the end of the day, this border happened to be in the middle of this parliament. And the thickness of that border on the maps results to be quite a thick place in the parliament. And therefore, we decided that this is where we would like to work on. This is the place where we are interested in. Palestinians are beyond West Bank and Gaza. Palestinians are in diaspora. Palestinians are everywhere. So where all Palestinian can be presented, if not through this thickness of the line.
The majority of the Palestinians were not part of this territorial formation. And therefore, in this crack of the line is where we pose the question of how to reimagine a parliament that is truly representing all Palestinians wherever they are. Schools began with a man under a tree who did not know he was a teacher, sharing his realization with others who did not know they were students. It is in this pedagogical spirit that we first established a tree school in Bahia, in southern Brazil, together with the Brazilian art collective Contrafilé, in the occasion of the 31st São Paulo Biennale in 2014. The tree, which is a living being, with its characteristic and history, is the device that creates a physical and metaphorical common territory where ideas and actions can emerge through critical, free, and independent discussion among participants. For this show, we have chosen the Raf tree, the survivor tree, able to resist in absence of water, high temperature, and searing winds. A rough tree opposes desertification and stabilizes dunes by improving soil. Tree School is the first and foremost a place where people gather for communal learning and production of knowledge grounded in lived experience and connected to communities. While for many knowledge is mainly based on information and skills, the Tree School places strong emphasis on the process of learning. These experiments want to be in dialogue with formal education institutions in order to create new spaces for learning. By activating critical and egalitarian environments, the Tree School functions around the interaction and interest of the participants and is consequently in constant transformation and open to accommodate changing urgencies. The Tree School, in fact, reclaims a different way of learning.
After 3 years of establishing campus in camps, the university that we did together with refugees in the Haitian refugee camp, the major question was for us, is it ever possible to take this experience somewhere else? Is it ever possible to share this very deep experience that we did for a long time with refugees in another place? And here we are invited to the São Paulo Biennale, and the idea was, how can we bring this knowledge to Brazil, and especially to the quilombolas, the descendants of slavery communities in Brazil after 500 years of being in Brazil from Africa, no? And the question that we brought, by only bringing these two realities together and these two stories together, it was an amazing school that we created in Bahia simply by being under a tree all together. And the question was for Palestinians, how can we deal with the right of return after 70 years of being in camps? And the question for the African Brazilians is, how can we return back to Africa after 500 years, and what Africa means for us? And one of the maybe potential answers that was given by one of the leaders of the quilombolas is that their way to return to Africa is by return to nature, and that the baobab tree was really the equivalent to the key of the house that Palestinians are taking in their hands. And then by planting these baobab trees in Brazil, it's a way for them to come back to Africa. And we felt that, this was a sort of natural, spontaneous school from where we all learned. There was no teachers and there was no students. We were all learning from each other, and especially we were all learning from our own life experience and not from books that were coming from somewhere else. UNESCO project is much more an attempt to recognize that, life in exile, even if it's exile, has value. And when Said was troubled of saying, he says, I'm not romanticizing exile, but exiled people at least speak 2 languages, at least know 2 places, and at least know more than a culture. He was saying, I'm not saying that we should all go for exile, but I cannot also negate that exile is a valuable condition, right? And in that sense, we want to bring this to UNESCO and to open this as a discussion, as a provocation to say, how should we look today at refugees? How should we look today at exile? Thing that I would like to add, the attempt was to invite the photographer that made the photos for the UNESCO heritage in Italy and ask him to do the same operation in the Haitian refugee camp. And when he was going, and when we asked him to use the same technique, right? So in order for it to be in the same level of... and then when Luca was coming back and forth to our house and showing us the pictures, at a certain point we came out with this idea, whenever we both walk in the camp in the night, we felt it was a completely different place than whenever we walk in it in the day. And since if you would look at all the photographers that made the photos, the journalist photos during the day in refugee camps, it's all about poor kids performing in a certain way, and the alleys of the camp, and mainly with some sewages outside. So it will show the whole miserable life in refugee camps. And whenever we walk in the night, we say, it reminded us very much with Venice, because we both lived for a long time in Venice. The smells of the food, the small alleys, the lights that are there. So we encouraged Luca to sort of make some photos in the night in the refugee camps.
It's not Ramallah, it's not the city, please. It has a history beyond the Palestinian.
You just got the line between the two. It's impossible.
It's just the Palestinian Authority.
Ramallah is a place of corruption. Ramallah is the center of the Ramallah. Ramallah is the center of everything that.
Many things went out of control. Certainly Oslo was a political project, right? And obviously the whole point was to create this false consciousness and make people begin to feel like they're living in a normal society. And that was the whole idea. I thought that was a project, was normalization.
So this project marked an important evolution in our work. In the early years of our practice, we had maybe naively the urgency to show and convince the West of the unjust situation in Palestine. By moving to Palestine, our urgency changed and became more important to engage more directly with the issues and problems that were relevant for people that live in Palestine. At that time, we opened our terrace for informal discussions among friends and guests, most of them based in Ramallah. They were trying to convince us to move to Ramallah, consider the center, and leave Bet Sahur considered a provincial village. As a provocation, we have started calling this perception of Ramallah as a center the Ramallah syndrome, an hallucination of normality, a fantasy of the possible coexistence of occupation and freedom. When Salwa Mekdadi, the curator of the first Palestinian pavilion in Venice, invited us to participate to the show, we asked to ourselves how and what represent Palestine today. We consider this informal discussion about the role played by Ramallah as essential to the national project after the collapse of the Oslo peace process. We impose on ourselves an embargo on production of images that try even to represent Palestine. Historically, as is known, there have been an overproduction of images about Palestine that rather than makes things more visible have actually produced its opposite, an invisibility to what is really at stake in Palestine. With the production of a sound installation recording from our hard discussion, we wanted to force the visitor, maybe one more time naively, to listen rather than looking at an image that could hardly challenge the 1,000 previously produced.
When we come back, and certainly the question is what form of life we can have and in which way we can live under colonialism. And this is why, in part we established the whole practice of decolonizing architecture, art, and residency inside our house, with this attempt of understanding how can we sort of afford to live under colonialism and how can we share together with other people a process of decolonization, and especially mind decolonization. And it felt like, Ramallah managed to create a cultural discourse where it can be very easily, compared to New York, without recognizing that Ramallah is still very strongly under colonialism. And for us, this was a big question. And we decided, actually, even I remember at the beginning of our establishing of the practice, we were refusing to go to Ramallah for meeting, and we were obliging anybody that would like to come and see us to come to Bet Sahur. And in that sense, of course, if people would get outside of Ramallah, they would encounter checkpoints, they would see what the rest of Palestine is. While if you decide to stay within Ramallah and within its coffee shops, you have this hallucination and this idea that everything is going okay. I mean, life is fine. You can take a cappuccino for a high price in one of the nicest coffee shops that you can find everywhere. The sound installation is made of a discussion with some intellectuals in Palestine, and some people that even wrote about this in a direct way or in indirect way, about the building of the state of Palestine and the position of Ramallah in this building of the state, and this need of normality and why not to be a normal people, no? And they had an argument, is the argument why not to be a normal people, and Ramallah is permitting us to be normal. And in a sense, we collected all these discussions and we decided to build this sound installation.
Ramallah Syndrome was produced during 2009. Now, looking back at that time from the perspective of today, one thing that changed radically, I would say that syndrome actually extended to many other cities in the West Bank. And I would say that maybe that syndrome is also something that can be brought critically and questioning maybe also other cities that in which there is a construction of normality. The Book of Exile was produced for the first time in occasion of Marrakesh Biennale. We were inspired by the time when the Kutubiyya Mosque in Marrakesh was used as a place for production of books, a time when calligraphers were instrumental in the diffusion and translation of knowledge in Arabic. In Marrakesh, we have asked the local school of calligraphy to reactivate these spaces and transcribe the Book of Exile produced in the Haitian refugee camp. Here in Abu Dhabi, the Book of Exile is transcribed by a local calligrapher in the library of the campus, continuing the long tradition of preserving and communicating knowledge across the Arab and Islamic civilization to the rest of the world.
When we visited the Kutubiyya Mosque in Marrakesh, we felt that everybody was a bit nostalgic to this moment where, calligraphers were sitting in the plaza of the Kutubiyya. They were an integral part of it, and they were sort of diffusing the knowledge in the Arab world from one place to another. And
by bringing, let's say, the work of Campus in Camps, or I would say the knowledge that we were able to document and produce in Campus in Camps here in Abu Dhabi, in a campus. Camp and campus share the same roots. They both are somehow confined places. And in this case, there is also the important other elements that the campus is a place for knowledge production. So what here, it seems to me, an interesting possibility is collapsing these two camp-like dimensions, of course radically different, but at the same time also try to understand and recognize the camp and the life in the camp and the knowledge that is producing in the camp as an important knowledge that needs to be preserved. So with the Book of Exile and the calligrapher in the library here in Abu Dhabi is also maybe a modest attempt to try to activate that knowledge and try to bring that knowledge in the campus.
Yeah, I sort of agree, and I feel also that, throughout all our work, we have all the time attempted to sort of give value to this knowledge with all forms possible, from, going to UNESCO, to using the way that, production was used, knowledge production was used to be going from one place to another in the Arab world, to creating a university. I think the whole, since ever we began to work in the refugee camp, all our attempt was to understand how to look at this culture as a potential valuable culture rather than a culture to be dismissed and to be forgotten and even not to think about.
In a cold winter in 1953, Palestinian family expelled from their villages south of Jerusalem during the Nakba found refuge in the Haitian refugee camp in Bethlehem, just a few kilometers away from their homes. During long nights, they were discussing how to protect themselves from the cold, since the tents that were given to them by humanitarian organizations were not conceived to last for so long. So how to substitute the tent with something more durable and better suited for inhabitation without giving up the right of return to their village of origin? These frightening and painful discussions have continued for almost 7 decades now. Every time that the new window have been opened, roof have been fixed, and extension of homes were made necessary to host growing families. These tensions between temporariness and permanency have produced a specific form of architecture. The concrete tent gives form to these contradictions. It expresses its limits, but also its potentialities for imagining a life liberated from permanent temporariness. In order to engage actively with this camp condition, in 2012, we established Campus in Camps as a gathering space for communal learning and production of knowledge grounded in refugee communities. One of the fundamental part of our work in campus and camps in relation to the concrete tent was what we call the collective dictionary. What was important for us was to give meanings to things and experience around what constitutes a refugee camp today. And therefore, with a group of students of campus and camps, we started to elaborate a series of words that had specific meanings for the camp itself. One of them, for example, was specifically important in our discovering. It was that in the camp, in fact, you cannot, for example, understand what is the public and what is the private. These are, for example, two fundamental concepts if one wants to understand how a city could work. In the camp, for example, there is no private property because refugees, despite they build their own houses, actually they cannot legally own them. At the same time, of course, there is no public in the camp because there is no municipality. But nevertheless, there is a strong sense and feeling of communality. And this is why in our discussion, what was very important was to come up with a term that was closer to this experience of a life that exists beyond the category of private and the public. And the students altogether choose the word of al-masha that was historically used during the Ottoman Empire to describe the land was communally owned by people that were farming the land, but in this case was closer to these conditions that refugee life have in the camp, in which somehow there is a form of collective living that exists beyond this notion of private and public.
Located between the domestic and the public sphere, Al-Madafa is in Arabic the living room, the room dedicated to hospitality. It is that part of the private house that has the potentiality to subvert the role of the guest and the host, and to give different political and social meaning to the act of hospitality. The living room opens itself to host the guest, the foreigner, the outsider, and function as a representational space between the domestic and the public.